The key fob in my hand clicked twice and did nothing. And on the other side of the gate, a woman I had known for exactly 9 days leaned over the fence with a plastic cup of white wine and told me I wasn't on the list. "Members only, Mr. Hendricks," Denise Pruitt said, smiling the way people smile when they think a smile is a weapon. "You're not on the list." Behind her, 40 or 50 people I'd never met were standing around the pool on my land, under a banner that read, "Cedar Hollow Summer Kickoff." And a kid in a security polo 2 sizes too big was already walking toward me with his hands up like I was the problem. I looked at the banner, and I looked at the brand new deck they'd built over the deep end, and I looked at the rekeyed lock on the gate to a pool that sat on ground my grandfather had owned before any of these people had a mortgage, and I decided, standing there in my work boots, that I was not going to say a single word I couldn't later read out loud in a room full of witnesses. So I didn't make a scene. I've learned that scenes are what people like Denise feed on. They came dressed for a fight, and I refused to be anybody's dinner. I took out my phone, and I photographed the banner, the deck, the rekeyed gate, and the little laminated sign taped to it that said, "Pool access restricted to members in good standing." I am Cole Hendricks. I was 41 years old that summer, and I run a grading and excavation outfit my grandfather started with 1 dozer and a bad knee. What Denise Pruitt did not know, sipping her wine and counting me as furniture, was that reading every page before you sign it isn't a personality trait in my family. It's a religion. That night I drove home, and before I did anything else, I mounted a small trail camera in the crook of the live oak that overlooks the gate, the same kind I use to catch people dumping fill on job sites. Then, I went to the closet in the back bedroom and pulled out my grandfather's fireproof box, the one he'd handed me the spring we buried him, and I started reading. Here is the part they never checked. My grandfather, Wallace Hendricks, owned 800 acres out here before Cedar Hollow Estates was a line on a plat. When the developers came, he sold them the buildable land and kept the low 2 acres by the creek, and in 1998, he did the neighborly thing and leased those 2 acres to the brand new Homeowners Association so they could put in a clubhouse and a pool. He leased it to them for $1 a year, for 25 years. And because he was who he was, he recorded that ground lease at the county, and he wrote 2 sentences into it that I read 4 times by the light of the kitchen stove. The first sentence set the term, 25 years, expiring 3 years before that pool party, with no automatic renewal. The second sentence said that upon expiration, any and all structures and improvements affixed to the land would become the property of the landowner. Fixtures. My grandfather, who never went to law school, had written a fixtures clause into a $1 lease, and then he had died, and everyone had forgotten the whole thing existed. Everyone except the county recorder's office, which forgets nothing. I also learned, from the same box, and from a special assessment notice taped to my own door, that the board had just voted to spend $200,000 of the members' money on the new deck and a poolside cabana. On my land. On a lease that had been dead for 3 years. I sent Denise a certified letter the next morning, polite as a church usher, informing the association that the ground lease had expired, that they were holding over without a tenancy, and that I'd be happy to discuss a new arrangement at fair market terms. I even said please. 3 days later, I got my answer, and my answer was a citation from the Cedar Hollow Architectural Committee fining me $250 for trespass and disruption of a community event, plus a warning that further incursions would be referred to their attorney. I stood in my driveway holding a fine for walking onto my own dirt, and I laughed once, out loud, because sometimes the universe hands you your own evidence gift-wrapped. That was the day I stopped being polite and started being precise. I posted the 2 acres myself, no trespassing signs every 50 feet, and I rekeyed the gate back. My land, my lock, my creek. I taped a copy of the recorded lease to the clubhouse door in a plastic sleeve so the rain wouldn't get it. And under it, I wrote the date it had expired. Within a day, the board called an emergency meeting, and I went. And I sat in the back with a legal pad while Denise Pruitt, the regional vice president of Sterling Ridge Community Management, named Marcus Vane, and a board attorney named Brett Halloran, explained to a room of nervous homeowners that Mr. Hendricks was mistaken, that the association had used the pool openly and continuously for decades, and that they intended to assert a prescriptive easement over the property. Halloran actually used the phrase, sweat equity. Then Denise, who could not help herself, leaned into the microphone and said the sentence that would eventually end her. The deed doesn't matter. This is community property now, and it has been for years. Up in the live oak by the gate, a camera I'd bought for $90 was recording every syllable. They called the sheriff on me the following weekend. I was standing at my own fence line, on the outside, taking photos of the cabana going up, when a deputy rolled up because a resident reported a man harassing a private facility. I have a great deal of respect for the men and women who do that job, and I made it easy for him. I handed him a printout from the county GIS showing the parcel lines, then the recorded lease with the expiration highlighted in yellow, then my deed. He read all three standing on the hood of his cruiser, and then he walked over to Denise, who had come out to watch me get arrested, and told her that this looked like a civil property matter, and that if she called again about a landowner standing on his own boundary, the conversation was going to go differently. She did not take it well. And Brett Halloran, sensing that sweat equity was not going to survive contact with a recorded instrument, reached into his folder and laid a document on the fence rail between us, like a man laying down a winning hand. It was a lease extension. 99 years. Signed, it said, by Wallace Hendricks. I picked it up, and I looked at the signature, which was close but wrong in the way forgeries are always close but wrong. And then I looked at the date, and the date was where the whole thing came apart in my hands. My grandfather had signed this lease, according to the paper, in the autumn of a year in which my grandfather had been dead since spring. I didn't say that out loud. That is the single most important decision I made in the entire mess, and I want to be clear about why. The moment you show a forger that you've spotted the forgery, you give him time to build a story around it. So I let Brett Halloran believe he'd rattled me. I said I'd have my attorney review it, and I drove away, and the second I was around the bend, I pulled over and just breathed for a minute. Because a fake lease with my dead grandfather's name on it is a different kind of insult than a $250 fine. And I needed to not be angry when I picked my next move. Then I went to work. I ordered a certified copy of my grandfather's death certificate. I pulled the notary's commission records from the Secretary of State because every notarized signature in this country leaves a paper trail whether the notary wants it to or not. And I went back through the fireproof box for exemplars of Walt's real signature, 20 years of them, on deeds and loan docs and the back of my high school report cards. The association, meanwhile, decided that the correct response to a landowner asserting his rights was to double down in the most public way they could invent. They threw another party. A unity barbecue, the flyer called it, right there on my 2 acres. And this time, they had the security kid actually block the gap in the fence when I walked the boundary, standing in front of me with his arms crossed, while Denise narrated to her friends that some people just can't accept being outvoted. They recorded a lien against my parcel for the $250 fine plus administrative costs that had somehow ballooned to $900. They put a paragraph in the community newsletter describing me as a squatter attempting to steal shared amenities from hardworking families. I read that newsletter twice, and then I quietly uploaded the footage from the live oak, the clean audio of Denise Pruitt saying the deed doesn't matter, this is community property now, and I saved it in 3 places, because I have learned the hard way that the universe loves to eat the one copy of the thing you needed. It was Dale Ferris who broke it open. Dale was the board treasurer, a retired freight dispatcher with an ulcer and a conscience. And he found me at the cluster mailbox on a Tuesday and said, without any preamble, "We need to talk, not on the property." We sat in the cab of my truck in the grocery store lot, and Dale told me the thing I had suspected but couldn't yet prove. They knew. They had known for over a year that the lease had expired because Dale himself had flagged it when he took over the books. Marcus Vane and Sterling Ridge had told the board not to worry about it, that possession was 9/10 of the law, and a landowner without deep pockets would never fight. When I sent my certified letter, they had panicked, and someone at the management company had produced the 99-year extension to paper over the hole. And here was the part that made Dale's ulcer worse. While everyone was arguing about the pool, the association's reserve fund had gotten very thin because Sterling Ridge had been billing the community for capital improvements and consulting against accounts that Dale could no longer reconcile. He gave me the emails. He gave me the reserve statements. He gave me, without quite meaning to, the whole map. Now I had all of it. And here is where I want to tell you I marched into a courtroom and got a verdict, because that's how these stories are supposed to go. I did file. I filed an action for ejectment, and I filed a claim to quiet title, because you use the law as a lever whether or not you ever pull it all the way. But I had already figured out that a courtroom, months away and behind closed doors, was the wrong place for this to end. These people had humiliated me in public, on my own land, in front of their neighbors. The debt was public, and it was going to be paid in public. So I pulled a permit, in my own name, as the landowner, to fence and secure the 2 acres and to shut off the water service to the pool, which ran through a meter my grandfather had installed and which had been quietly in the Hendricks name the entire time. I want to be precise here, because I walked right up to the line and I know it. I never touched a person. I never cut a lock that wasn't mine, and every single thing I did with a permit and a recorded instrument behind it. The pool went dark and green within a week. The Unity barbecues stopped. And Marcus Vane, who had been treating this whole thing as a real estate problem, suddenly requested a private meeting, because it had finally occurred to him that it was becoming a fraud problem, and fraud problems have his name on them. I did not take the private meeting. I took the annual meeting instead. Every homeowners association in the country has one. A night in a rented hall where the board reports on the year and asks the members to approve the budget. And this year, Denise Pruitt walked to the podium and asked the members to approve a special assessment, $400 a household, to fund the legal defense of community property against a hostile landowner. That was the word she used about me, in a room full of the people whose money she was spending. That was when I stood up. I had asked the chair for 5 minutes, and he gave them to me because Dale Ferris made sure he did. I did not raise my voice. I put the recorded ground lease on the projector, and I read the expiration date. I put the fixtures clause up next, and I let them sit with it a second. And then I told them, in plain words, that the $200,000 deck and cabana they had just paid for now legally belonged to me, because they had built it on my land after the lease had died. And that was the law of fixtures, and I hadn't written it. Then I played 8 seconds of audio. Denise Pruitt's own voice filled the hall. "The deed doesn't matter. This is community property now." You could hear a folding chair creak somewhere in the back. Then I put up the 99-year extension, and beside it the death certificate, and I asked the room a simple question. How does a man sign a lease 5 months after his own funeral? And before Denise could reconstruct her face, I put up the last slide, the one even I had needed 2 weeks to nail down, the notary's commission record from the Secretary of State. The notary who had supposedly witnessed my grandfather's signature had not been a notary on that date. Her commission wasn't issued until the following year. The paper wasn't just signed by a dead man. It was witnessed by a woman who, on the day in question, had no more authority to notarize a document than the folding chairs did. That was 2 impossibilities stacked on 1 page, and 2 impossibilities is not a mistake. It is a manufacture. Dale Ferris stood up then, on his own, and told the room what he'd told me in my truck, that the board had known, that the management company had told them to sit on it, that the reserves were short. Marcus Vane, who had come to defend Sterling Ridge, did the thing that finished Denise for good. He stood up and very carefully explained that the management company had no involvement in the preparation of any lease extension, and that any such document was generated at the direction of the board president. In one sentence, he threw her into the fire to keep his own company out of it, which told everyone in the room that there was, in fact, a fire. I watched Denise Pruitt understand, in real time, that the 40 people who had stood around my pool with plastic cups were now looking at her the way you look at a person who has spent your money defending a crime. Somebody near the front made a motion to remove the board. Somebody else said the word prosecutor out loud, and it hung there, and nobody argued with it. It didn't need me after that. Denise resigned within the week, along with Halloran's 2 closest allies on the board, all 3 of them, for personal reasons, under the polite fiction that a resignation makes a forgery referral go away. It does not. Merrow County took the notary records and the death certificate and the extension, and that file is not mine to finish. Sterling Ridge Community Management, facing the very real prospect that no involvement wouldn't survive discovery, terminated its contract with Cedar Hollow and paid a quiet settlement to make the reserve question disappear before an auditor could make it loud. And I got what my grandfather's 2 careful sentences had always guaranteed me. The holdover meant back rent at fair market value, not $1 a year. The fixtures clause meant the deck and the cabana they'd built to spite me were mine the day they screwed the last board down. I own the pool now, the whole 2 acres, free of any lease, and the association uses it under a new agreement that I wrote and that they read very, very carefully before they signed, which I understand is a novel experience for them. I turned the water back on the day the new agreement was recorded. I did not put my name on the list. Author's note. Stepping out of Cole's shoes for a second, because there's a lesson in the wreckage. Where did the board go wrong? They confused loudness with authority. Denise Pruitt genuinely believed that a vote could override a deed, and that belief walked her from an expired lease, an honest, fixable problem, straight into forgery and public humiliation. The 3 things that sank her were all sitting in plain sight from the first night. A recorded lease with a fixtures clause the board never bothered to read, a $90 camera that caught her saying the quiet part into a microphone, and a date on a fake document that a dead man could not possibly have signed. Real power leaves a paper trail. Fake power just leaves fingerprints. Practical takeaways. If you ever find yourself across the fence from a board like this, pull your own parcel from the county GIS and read your recorded documents before you argue with anyone. Never tip your hand the instant you spot a forgery. Let it exist while you gather the record that destroys it. Put everything in certified mail and let cool paperwork do the work your temper wants to do. And remember that a courtroom is one option, not the only one. Sometimes the most complete justice happens at a podium, in front of the exact people who were told you were the villain. Here's my question for you. Cole never raised his voice and never broke a law. He just out-documented them. So be honest in the comments. If an HOA threw a party on land you owned and fined you for walking onto it, could you have stayed that calm? Or would you have handed them the scene they were hoping for?